fall of Japan, of course, we're going to look at how the United States is able to, and the Allies are able to kind of bring Japan to its knees, how this happens, and ultimately how the war is won in the Pacific. Now, we talked, of course, about one of these really important ideas, this very important concept that is created right at the outset of the war by Marshall, and that is unity of command. Eisenhower at the beginning of the war, and they're having these meetings with the British, and they're really talking about how the Americans are insistent we have unity of command in theaters. And yet it's ironic that in a predominantly American theater, they actually split command. In the Pacific, we essentially have two commanders here. We essentially have two sub-theaters. We have something called the Southwest Pacific Area. The Southwest Pacific Area is right here. So Australia up to kind of through the Philippines and what have you. That's the Southwest Pacific Area, and that is ruled by MacArthur. That is MacArthur's fief. And he's based in Australia, primarily in Australia, and he is responsible for the advance there. And then, in addition to that, we, of course, have the Pacific Ocean area, which is this here. So that is under Chester Nimitz, right? That is under Chester Nimitz. So it's interesting that, as I say, as much as the Americans really, really, really call for this idea of unity of command, in the Pacific, which is pretty much an American show. I mean, certainly the British are involved in Burma quite a bit, in the Indian Ocean quite a bit, but mostly what's going on here, and we are supplemented by the Australians and the New Zealanders, but it's primarily an American show, okay? Pacific is primarily an American show, and we don't practice unity of command there. We have two different command areas here. Now, the reason, kind of the root cause of this division of why we have this difference is rooted in something I'm sure you appreciate, and that is the inter-service rivalry between the Army and the Navy. Okay, the inter-service rivalry between the Army and the Navy. This plagues the Pacific in a way it doesn't in the European, because everybody knows Europe is going to be an Army show. The Navy will be necessary to transport the Army ultimately to get there and for the invasions and what have you, but ultimately that's going to be an Army show, right? The Army's going to dominate in Europe. But in the Pacific, it's not so clear because we've got these vast distances, and the Navy is going to be responsible for that. Nimitz certainly considers the Pacific a Navy show. He thinks, obviously, self-evidently, it has to be a Navy show. But by contrast, you've got MacArthur. Now, here's the thing about MacArthur. MacArthur is a former Chief of Staff of the United States Army. He is one of the highest-ranking American officers, longest-serving, most experienced officers in the U.S. Army. And what's more, he has a lot of popular support at home. And so, how do you subordinate MacArthur to anyone, let alone somebody of another service, right? So that's where they make the compromise about the different areas there. And MacArthur doesn't particularly have a lot of respect for the Navy. He said that the Navy was, I think he said the Navy was like a third or fourth rate Navy. Like right at the outset of the war, he says our Navy is a third or fourth rate Navy. And of course he takes a lot of flack for that. And that never stops. And in a real sense, the inter-service rivalry between Army and Navy will be a major concern throughout the war. Now, it's never as bad as the rivalry in Japan between the Army and Navy, where they're literally killing each other sometimes. But it's still bad. It's still bad. Now, within the Southwest Pacific area, we have the U.S. 6th Army, commanded by Walter Kruger. Now, Walter Kruger, you may recall, he commanded the 3rd Army during the Louisiana maneuvers in 1941. He was born in Prussia. He still had a slight German accent, okay? But again, it just goes to show that not only did America have better generals than the Germans, we had better Germans than the Germans. And then we also have, in addition to the 6th Army, we have the 8th Army under Robert L. Eichelberger. Robert L. Eichelberger. Now, also, too, what is unusual for this situation is most theater commanders report to the Combined Chiefs of Staff. Now, remember, the Combined Chiefs of Staff is this integrated British and American kind of operational and planning agency, okay? Pretty much everyone else in Europe, everyone's reporting to that. But MacArthur and Nimitz, too, they report to the U.S. Joint Chiefs. So they report to the U.S. So this is a national, seen as kind of a national command authority, rather than the international command authority that's established by the Combined Chiefs of Staff pretty much everywhere else all over the world. So it's kind of an unusual relationship there. Now, MacArthur, because this is a naval operation, MacArthur commands naval units. He has naval units directly under his command, but oftentimes they're not enough for the operations he wants to pull off. So he's frequently going to the Navy hat in hand, which does not suit MacArthur, begging for ships for his units here. And Nimitz will loan them, and very rarely will he get them back. But by 1944, they've got the 6th Armies, the 8th Armies. He also commands the 5th Air Force and the 7th Fleet. MacArthur commands the 5th Air Force and the 7th Fleet. And the 7th Fleet came to be known as MacArthur's Navy. MacArthur's Navy. All right, so in 1943, the United States begins offensives in a lot of different places. We have the New Guinea campaign, the Solomons Islands, the Gilbert Islands, the Marshall Islands. A lot of these engagements begin in 42, but they really take up some steam here in 43. Now we also have, in the Gilbert Islands, of course, in November, we have the landings at the Tarawa Atoll. And the Marines, of course, most of these landings are by Marines in the Pacific area, right? And very high casualties at Tarawa. And as a result of what happens at Tarawa, they really start to up their game. The Americans really start to up their game when it comes to amphibious landings. Better technology, better tactics, better doctrine. And critically, part of it is, before they land, they want to have an escort of battleships, cruisers that can just unleash hell with their guns on these islands before the Americans land, but just batter the islands as much as they can. And pretty quickly here, between, like I said, with 42, by 43 to 44, the Marines become masters of amphibious invasions. The Marines become absolute masters of amphibious invasions. Now, we also have, too, one of the kind of often underlooked, under-recognized contributions that the United States makes to victory in this war is the U-boat campaign, the American U-boat campaign. When we think of U-boats in World War II, we think of the Germans and everything they did. But immediately, not long after the war begins, we start sending U-boats on these patrol missions to kind of raid Japanese supply lines, right? Now remember, the Japanese started this war because they wanted the raw materials of the Dutch East Indies. And so it's kind of our goal to make sure that as little of that as possible actually makes it to Japan. So the U.S. submarines go out. Their primary role here is to attack merchant vessels. Just like the Kriegsmarine in the Atlantic, you're attacking merchant vessels. Where you can, you want to take down troop transports and stuff like that. But you want to make sure you're taking down merchant vessels. In 1944, thanks to American submarines, only a trickle of oil from the Dutch East Indies makes it to Japan. We become very effective at taking down the Japanese ships here. And then, in 1945, Japan, of course, is going to surrender in August. So there's 8.5 months in 1945 of the war, okay? In that 8.5 months, not one drop of oil from the Dutch East Indies makes it to Japan. Not one drop. Over the course of the war, the U.S. Navy will deploy about 288 submarines against Japan. 288 submarines against Japan. And in total, they sink nearly 1,400 Japanese ships, resulting in nearly 9 million tons. Additionally, submarines are used to rescue downed Allied airmen. If airmen, we have like submarines in places where they can do rescue operations. If we think there's a chance that Americans might go down. One of the most famous Americans who was rescued by a submarine in World War II. Does anybody know? He was an airman. He was a naval aviator. He got shot down. George H.W. Bush shot down over Chichijima. Chichijima is the Japanese early warning. They got their radar system there. That's their early warning for Americans attacking the home islands. So we were bombing the radar installations there constantly. 8 Americans are shot down over the island of Chichijima. The commander of the garrison there, the Japanese garrison, was crazy. And he and his officers, when they capture these 8 airmen, and this is over the course of a few months, when they capture these airmen, they eat them. Okay? George Bush is shot down, and he lands in the bay. He's got a raft, and he is paddling against the tide, which is bringing him in. And as he's paddling against the tide, the Japanese start getting out in boats to go get him. His friends, Bush's friends in their planes, start strafing the Japanese to keep them away from him. He paddled away from the tide for a day, and submarine came up and rescued him. He spent like the next 6 months on the submarine. George W. Bush, he actually lied about his age. He was younger. He was like 16 or 17. He lied so that he could get into the Navy. So June of 1944, the United States prepare to invest in the Marianas Island group. The intention was to retake 3 islands that the Japanese had taken: Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. And the force that's sent here consists of 127,000 men. 127,000 men. And they were transported by Admiral Raymond Spruance's 5th Fleet. There were 535 warships here that are involved in this operation. Now, the Allies have been constantly bombing this. They've been softening these targets for months. So the Japanese air power is virtually non-existent, and the garrison on Saipan, the Japanese garrison, was about 32,000, which was more than they expected. On June 15th, the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions land on Saipan under heavy fire, and they land Amtraks, which are kind of like tanks, but they're amphibious. And they don't get very far because the Japanese artillery fire is pretty good at knocking these things out. By nightfall, here on Saipan, the Marines hold about a 13-mile beachhead with about 20,000 men. About a 13-mile beachhead with about 20,000 men. That night, the Japanese, knowing they're probably not going to make it, they got nothing to lose, they launch 2 suicidal banzai attacks, meaning they literally just run, bayonets out, and try to overwhelm with numbers. Now, this kind of tactic may have worked in Napoleon's day, but when you're coming up against machine guns and mortars and other weapons, it's not too good. The destroyers kept sending up illumination flares so they could see him coming. And the Marines were able to hold their position and just decimate these attackers that are coming at them that night. Now, during this battle on Saipan, Admiral Spruance, there's Spruance here, he actually sends out Admiral Mark Michener to kind of find the Japanese fleet, locate the Japanese fleet there, and take him out. And the Japanese admiral here is Jizaburo Ozawa. And the Americans have 15 carriers, okay? And so they've got massive air power, concentration of air power here with 15 carriers. 18 June, Ozawa makes a decision to engage. He sends 69 aircraft to engage the American fleet, and of course they're detected by radar. They see them coming in. Michener launches his Hellcats. Now, we talked about the F-4F Hellcat, right? We talked about how amazing this plane is, okay? So Michener launches his Hellcats, and they take out 42 of the Japanese planes pretty quickly. 42 of them pretty quickly. The Japanese send in a second wave of 128 planes. The Hellcats down 70. Over the course of this ensuing battle, which happens during this day, the Hellcats down to a total of 240 Japanese planes. 240 Japanese planes. The U.S. submarines sank 2 Japanese aircraft carriers. U.S. submarines sank 2 Japanese carriers, the Shokaku and the Taiho. Taiho was Ozawa's flagship. Ozawa believed that most of his planes would return eventually, that they were not down, they had just gone to land temporarily on Guam, maybe to refuel before they headed back to his carriers. So he's kind of overconfident. He thinks a lot of his planes are coming back, which are not going to come back. So on 20th June, Michener launches 216 aircraft, which gets through a very small Japanese cap, a very small Japanese fighter screen here. And over the course of this battle, the Hellcats are able to destroy 65 aircraft, and the bombers are able to sink the Hiryu, which is another carrier, and 2 oil tankers, and damage several more ships as well. So the Japanese, all told, will go on to lose another 80 aircraft, and a lot of those are not lost by American action. A lot of them are lost because they simply run out of fuel or they crash when they land on the carrier or on islands. They end up crashing. This battle then, because over the course of these days, the Japanese lose 400 aircraft and 3 carriers. 400 aircraft and 3 carriers. So this battle, of course, comes to be known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, because it seemed like the American pilots, it was just so easy to shoot down Japanese planes here. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Now, I mentioned this inter-service rivalry. We're going to see it come to a head here. This happens during the battle on Saipan. We have a couple of Smiths here. We have Howland Mad Smith, who was a Marine general. And then we have Ralph Smith, who was an Army general. Okay? Now, General Smith is a Corps commander. He commands the 4th Amphibious Corps. Well, they need to reinforce what they're doing here, and they actually send an Army infantry division, the 27th Infantry Division, under Ralph Smith to take part in this battle here. Now, the problem is the Army and the Marines have very different doctrines. The Army is more cautious. The Marines, their whole attitude is, you've got to get the beachhead. You've got to get the beachhead, so you just keep going, you take it. Marines are much more about blunt force. Army tends to, in theory in it anyway, be more about maneuver, right? And kind of taking your time maneuvering. Well, because of this, Holland Smith is not very impressed with the lack of progress that Ralph Smith seems to be making here. And again, Holland Smith doesn't really appreciate these doctrinal and tactical differences between the services here. So on June 24th, 1944, on June 24th, 1944, Holland Smith relieves Ralph Smith. Now this has very significant consequences, because here you have a Marine general relieving an Army general. A Marine general relieving an Army general. The Army is outraged. How dare a Navy, and you know, if you're in the Marines, you're a naval officer, right? How dare a naval officer relieve an Army general? He has no authority to do that. And this threatens this good working relationship, or effective working relationship, between the Army and the Navy. So the Army is looking for blood. The Army, in particular, the kind of head of the Army in the Pacific, in the Pacific Central area here, his name was Richardson, he wants blood. He wants to make an example here. So what they do is the Army itself holds kind of a board of inquiry. This is not an inter-service board of inquiry or anything. It's the Army itself holds a board of inquiry. And they're not too keen on seeking out testimony from Marines or getting input from Marines here. They're kind of looking for voice to their outrage here. But they do something here. They appoint a guy to command this board of inquiry, to lead this board of inquiry, an Army general by the name of Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr. Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr. Buckner here, he had actually served as the military commander of Alaska for much of the war. He was the military commander of Alaska for much of the war. And Marshall really liked him. Marshall really thought this was a good guy, and he wants to get him a command somewhere. He makes him a lieutenant general. He wants to get him a command. But he leads this thing, and maybe with an eye toward the possibility of commanding something in the Pacific and not wanting to offend the Navy, who knows. Buckner actually, what they find was that the board rules, Holland Smith acted within his authority. He acted within his authority. But the move was not justified by the facts. So what they're saying is he had the right to do it, but he probably shouldn't have, which is kind of a compromise. Right? It kind of doesn't ruffle feathers. So a lot of people who wanted to foster a good working relationship between the services, they're very happy with Buckner here. They're very happy with him. Richardson, who was his superior, direct superior, wasn't too happy with him, but nevertheless, it kind of calms this down. Now, this is important because we're going to be discussing Buckner a lot more in a moment. Well, maybe we'll get to it next time. But one thing I will say about Buckner is, and maybe I mentioned this before, his father. Well, let me go back. So, in the 1850s, Ulysses S. Grant, the great Civil War general, he had served in the Mexican War, and after the Mexican War, he's in California. And Grant got really lonely. He missed his wife. He missed his family. He really had a hard time. And if you've ever heard that Ulysses S. Grant was a drunk, he was not someone that was drinking constantly. He was someone that would go for 6 months without touching any alcohol, and then he'd go like on a 2-week bender. Okay, that's kind of drunk he was. Well, what happened was he's there on this base in California, and he gets lonely, and he starts drinking. Well, it just so happened a senior officer showed up on that base and conducted an inspection and found him drunk, and he said to Grant, you got 2 choices. You can resign or we'll court-martial you. So Grant resigned from the Army. He didn't have any money to get home. Well, there's another officer on the base who loans him money so that he can get home. This officer that loaned him money on the base, he's from Kentucky, his name was Simon Buckner. Okay? Now, when the Civil War breaks out, now Grant's a failure. He's not succeeding in getting anything, and then the Civil War breaks out, and he's a great general. He's a great general. And right at the beginning of the Civil War, early 1862, February 62, he takes a couple of forts in Tennessee. One of the forts he takes is Fort Donelson. The commander of Fort Donelson is Simon Buckner. And he famously says, Buckner says, okay, we'll abandon the fort, let my people leave, and we'll give you the fort. And Grant responds, I will accept nothing but unconditional surrender. Right? And this is where Roosevelt got that phrase. So he takes the fort there. Well, years later, in his 60s, Simon Buckner will have a son. And this is Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr. here. And he's going to, as we will see, command the 10th Army on Okinawa eventually. So by early July, the Japanese force have been pushed back to the northern point of the island, the northern point of Saipan. On 7 July, the Japanese launch another massive banzai charge at the American lines with 3,000 soldiers and sailors, running at them with bayonets, with swords, and they're running right toward the 27th Infantry Division. They slaughter a lot of them, but they keep coming. The battle here lasts for 2 days, and it does devolve into hand-to-hand fighting in some areas here, bless you. But ultimately, of course, the American numbers come into play, and they emerge triumphant. On Saipan, the Americans lost 14,000 dead and wounded, and the Japanese lost 30,000 dead. Not many in the way of wounded or prisoners. 14,000 dead and wounded for the Americans, 30,000 dead for the Japanese. And then within days, U.S. forces take Tinian and Guam. They retake Tinian and Guam. Now this is important because the Marianas here, or not the these islands here in the chain, these are going to be the islands from which that we will see the B-29 superfortress will take off from to bomb Japan. So these are the important bases we need that are close enough to Japan to do that. Okay, so we're going to take a look at some of the key failures and mistakes here that are made by the Japanese in this last point of the war. Now, as we know, the Japanese had this plan at the beginning of the war. It falls apart immediately, and they never have a plan B. The Japanese never come up with a strategic plan B for the war. Once the Americans don't stick to the script they set out, things don't go well for them. Now, the highest planning and operational body for Japan was the Imperial General Headquarters. The Imperial General Headquarters. This provides, in theory, strategic direction for the war. Now, as we know, we've got this massive Army-Navy rivalry that's even worse among the Japanese than it is among the Americans. And this complicates operations throughout the Pacific. The Imperial General Headquarters, it meets twice a week, and they have 2 kind of sections, an Army section and a Navy section. And despite the fact that the Army and the Navy, their highest planners, meet together twice a week, ostensibly to work to create a combined strategy, the 2 organizations often create their own plans, really without reference, without regard to the others, and then they issue orders down their chains of command, even before you can have any kind of coordination between these 2 services. And here's the rub. Here's the thing. You need, a country like Japan, a country like America, a country like England, needs an Army and a Navy. You need them both. You need them both. And if they're not working together, it's a scary thing. Now again, the Japanese do not practice unity of command like the Germans. They don't have unity of command at the operational level here. So again, very often you have like an Army Supreme Commander and a Navy Supreme Commander. They have their own kind of command structures in every region here where they're fighting here. The two services coordinated only when it was absolutely necessary, and then only begrudgingly. Now, Japanese operations, going back to the indoctrination that the Japanese kind of filled themselves with at the beginning of when the Spirit Warriors come to power in the 1920s, they emphasize the offensive spirit and maneuver. Attack, attack, attack. Offense is better than defense, right? And the Japanese place very low stock, and they're kind of like the Germans in this way. They place a much lower stock in things like logistics and intelligence. Remember, the Germans neglected logistics and intelligence. They were great at operations, but they lacked those other things there. And so neither the Japanese Army nor the Navy had serious logistical officers on their staff. I read that letter, I think, last time from Eisenhower to Somerville. Brian Somerville, was the head of the U.S. Services of Supply. We had a whole big, giant part of the Army that was just dedicated to logistics. Japanese don't have anything like this here. They don't attempt to gain any sophisticated intelligence gathering or analytical sections or processes during the war. Beyond the most basic, they really don't really develop those aspects of their militaries. Certainly not anywhere nearly sophisticated as the Allies will develop theirs. And one reason why they don't do that is because, do you remember in Kursk, the Battle of Kursk, it was obvious where the Germans were going to attack, right? The Russians knew where the Germans were going to attack, right? Yeah. Well, it's kind of the same thing in the Pacific. The Japanese can kind of tell very often, by this point in the war, what the next step is, right? Where the Americans are going to hit next, right? They have a much better sense of that. So they feel we don't really need to develop intelligence because we kind of can know where they're coming here. But one of the big problems, too, with the Japanese by this point in the war, one of the big issues here with the Japanese at this point in the war, is they've got this huge navy. Of course, the Japanese have a huge navy, and as we know, in this war, what's the most important part of the Navy in this war? Aircraft carriers and aircraft to service them. Well, at this point in the war, one of the things you do, essentially, if let's say we got an Essex-class carrier in Honolulu, and we want to get this out, but it doesn't have any Hellcats yet. Well, what do? We would actually ferry Hellcats from the West Coast on another carrier or on ships to be assembled there in Pearl Harbor. Then they go on the carrier, right? We lift them on cranes onto the carrier. The Japanese don't have any carriers or any other kinds of logistical ability to ship fighters to the various parts of their empire, which means the only way they can get fighters to the various parts of their empire is by flying them there. But you're talking about vast distances. So they'd work out the courses. Okay, we fly to here, refuel. Fly to here, refuel. Fly to here, refuel. Fly to here, refuel. The problem is most of these pilots by this part of the game, they're not that good. They don't have a lot of training. There's not enough fuel to train these guys. So for these long distance flights, I'll tell you right now, I used to fly. Just flying over land where you've got stuff you can recognize is difficult. When you're when you're a new pilot, it's hard to find it out. When you're on the Pacific Ocean, when everything looks the same for 1,000 miles, so what happens is we see a significant attrition loss of Japanese aircraft just flying them to where they can fight. Okay, just getting these aircraft to where they can fight. You see a significant attrition loss there. Navigation errors, pilots running out of fuel, ditching in the ocean. And so the result ultimately is this tremendously under-strength air power pretty much in every Japanese forward position and every Japanese island. They'll usually have some air power there, but not nearly what they were expecting. Phillips Payson O'Brien wrote a great book called How the Allies Won, and he talks about this. And he talks about, again, it's the tyranny of distance and these inexperienced pilots were as big a shot in the arm to the Japanese as our own pilots were, right? We're going to go and take back the Philippines. MacArthur wants to fulfill his promise to take back the Philippines. U.S. planners are skeptical. They're saying, well, you know what? Do we really need to take back the Philippines? Maybe we should concentrate on other islands or what have you. But MacArthur was insistent, no, we take back the Philippines. And MacArthur very often gets his way. In fact, he had a meeting with Roosevelt in late 1944 in Hawaii, and there's a suggestion there. He even threatened Roosevelt. He said, if you don't give me this operation, I will essentially tell everybody back home you're not doing a very good job as president, and it will hurt your chances in the 44 elections. And, you know, Roosevelt, whatever else he was a politician, and he knew MacArthur's words would carry weight. Now, to what extent that was a legitimate threat, who knows, but that suggestion has been made there. In any event, MacArthur is going to head back to the Philippines. He's going to take the 6th Army with him, and the 7th Fleet will approach the Philippines here from the south toward the island of Leyte. And under the command of Admiral William Bull Halsey, he's going to take with him 16 carriers that will provide protection from the fleet from the north. He's in the 3rd Fleet. Bill Halsey's in the 3rd Fleet coming down from the north as the 7th Fleet is coming up from Australia to invade from the south. This operation will entail a total of 225 warships, and the U.S. force of both fleets consists of roughly 35 aircraft carriers. 35 aircraft carriers. So this, again, is just a massive assemblage of air power. On 20 October, the invasion fleet landed 4 divisions on Leyte, the island of Leyte. MacArthur, of course, goes ashore here. He was sure he was photographed here. The president of the Philippines is also accompanying him at this time, so he comes. He's not the same president as there was at the beginning of the war. Quezon had died. But within days, the Japanese resistance on the island starts to stiffen. And the chief of the Japanese combined fleet was Toyoda Semu, and he decides to launch an attack on this American fleet here at Leyte. He only has 4 carriers. But he has a ton of battleships and heavy cruisers, including he's got a Yamato-class battleship. These are the biggest battleships ever constructed. A Yamato-class battleship. A Yamato-class battleship weighed about 68,000 tons. As I said, the largest battleship in the world. So this battle here at Leyte Gulf, this is the biggest naval battle in the history of the world that has ever been fought. Biggest naval battle that has ever been fought in the history of the world. And during during the very beginning here on October 25th, or I should say the morning of the 25th, the Japanese introduced this new weapon, the kamikaze. The kamikaze, of course, is a pilot in a plane that is loaded with nothing but explosives, and the plane is a giant torpedo. They're using planes to crash into American ships and to take them down and to take them to the bottom. During this battle, the Americans lost 3,000 men. And the Japanese lost 12,500 men. Americans lost 3,000 men. Japanese lost 12,500. Americans sank to the bottom 6 warships and 255 planes. 6 warships and 255 planes. The Japanese lost 28 warships and 300 planes. 28 warships and 300 planes, approximately. This fighting, then, after the major battle here, will continue on the island into December. The fighting on the island will continue into December. You can see here kind of the dispositions here of the fleet. This is Leyte right here. This is where most of the battle actually takes place. You can see the blue is the American, the red is the Japanese there. The general here that we're facing is Tomoyuki Yamashita. He was known as the Tiger. He was the guy, we talked about him a few weeks ago. He's the guy that took Singapore right at the beginning of the war. And after he takes Singapore, he was very popular, and he had a lot of enemies in the army, and so they actually give him this kind of remote job in like commanding a garrison in China. And he's kind of out of the war. But then when things are getting real, they realize he's a pretty good general, so they bring him back to help defend the Philippines here. Well, Yamashita knows the Americans are soon going to land on Luzon. Luzon is the main island or the biggest island there of the Philippines, where Manila is. And so he decides he is not going to try to defend the city of Manila himself. He pulls 152,000 men back from the hills away from Manila. But a small detachment of 16,000 Japanese Marines petitioned to be left in the city. And he says, okay. So he tells these Japanese Marines, you can hold the city. So he pulls his main force back to the hills. The small detachment of the Japanese Marines is left in the city of Manila. These Japanese Marines inflict some of the absolute most disgusting and disturbing atrocities committed in the war. What happens here as the Americans are approaching Manila is just one of the worst things you can imagine. It rivals the rape of Nanjing. There was, not to get too graphic, but there were a few instances. There was a Red Cross hospital, and a lot of the Filipino civilians were there. One of the people that was in this Red Cross hospital was an actress, a famous Filipino actress. She just had a baby. The baby was a few months old. The Japanese come into this hospital, and they literally just bayonet everyone they see, doctors, nurses, patients. They find this woman, they bayonet her, and I think it's something like they bayoneted the baby like 16 times or something like that. And the baby, of course, died, but despite her wounds, she survived, and she later gave testimony in the war crimes trial of Yamashita. There was a club in the middle of town called the German Club. It was owned by Germans. And in the German Club, the Japanese, a lot of people were hiding there. There's I think like a place under the stage where people could hide from the Japanese. And finally the Japanese just said screw it, and they firebombed the place, and when people come out, they shoot them. One of the big places, when the Japanese go into the Philippines, there was a Santo Tomas University in the Philippines. They turned this university campus into a giant kind of civilian prison camp. So all these Americans and other Westerners are essentially sent to live here on the campus at Santo Tomas University. And they are treated absolutely horribly here. One of the favorite things the guards like to do is they would force, for no reason really, just for a bit of sport, they'd force prisoners to stare directly at the sun for hours. And just other absolutely horrible things would happen here. But I trust me when I tell you, I am not getting into even a small fraction of some of the things. You want to read a book that will keep you up at night, Rampage by James Scott. It goes into great detail about what was done here. It's a very hard book to read, and it's one of the best books I've ever read, and probably the hardest book I've ever had to read. He read the Black Snow book, the same guy that did the Black Snow book. Well, General MacArthur, he refuses to bomb Manila because, of course, there's a lot of civilians in there. And Manila, he's got a lot of fondness for it. He lived there. He doesn't want to destroy the city. So Kruger's 6th Army is forced to essentially battle block by block. And they do fire artillery here. And unfortunately, a lot of the artillery does end up killing Filipino civilians. Many Filipino civilians were quite angry at the Americans for that as well, even though, you're caught between the Americans and the Japanese, Japanese artillery shell or American artillery shell are being mutilated by the Japanese, Well, American tanks and artillery, again, they probably end up destroying as much of the city as bombing would have at any point. But with his 3 divisions, Kruger takes the city after about a month of fighting. And it was sad, too, because MacArthur, as he's approaching the city, he takes a little section of the city, and he radios back, yep, we secured Manila, before the city was secured. And, of course, that was a big problem there. But here on Manila, the U.S. sustains 6,500 casualties, and virtually all of those 16,000 Japanese Marines are killed in the fighting. Virtually all of the 16,000 Japanese Marines are killed in the fighting. From March to August 1945, the 6th Army pretty much seeks out and reduces other strongholds of Japanese resistance on Luzon. And just very quickly as a personal side, I did a play years ago with a guy who he was a young man who was drafted right at the end of the war, and he was very, very upset that he was getting into the war at the Philippines after they'd been liberated. He wasn't going to see any combat. He wanted to fight. And he was mad, and so he was a courier. And so he essentially would ride a motorcycle up and down the Philippines delivering messages. Same thing Hitler did in World War I. And he's on this motorcycle delivering messages. Well, one day he's on the road out in the countryside. There's mountains over the side, and as he's driving, he hears ping. Someone's shooting at him. Someone's shooting. He looks up in the hills and you see this Japanese guy shooting at him. He said he dodged and he weaved. He got out of there, and he said after that cured him of any desire to see combat again. Okay. Now, before Pearl Harbor happened, before we actually had the United States get involved in the war, George Marshall kind of had ordered a study on kind of a contingency study. If war were to break out between Japan and the U.S., how could the United States effectively bomb Japan? How could the United States effectively bomb Japan? And, of course, the big problem we talked about that Paul Kennedy mentioned is the tyranny of distance, right? So, of course, you have to be able to get secure bases close enough to Japan in order to bomb it. And part of this, so these are some of the things people are thinking about even before Pearl Harbor. But by 1945, the B-29 was finally in operational use. And we have bases close enough to Japan that we can now actually effectively bomb the Japanese homeland. So raiding, a consistent raiding was now possible. Now remember, we had bombed Tokyo and other cities with the Doolittle raids early in the war, which required relatively light bombers on carriers, and they didn't really accomplish a lot as far as... They weren't very effective in bombing to hurt Japan's war effort, the Doolittle raids. It was much more a symbolic action, right? But now we're talking about doing to Japan what we have done to Germany, and that is just kind of systematic destruction by the air of Japanese infrastructure, military bases, and ultimately the cities themselves. Japan is a highly urbanized society, and it always has been. At the time, about 4 in 10 Japanese people lived in cities. About 4 in 10 Japanese people lived in cities. And so the destruction of these cities was meant, of course, to cripple Japanese military production, as well as severely impact Japanese morale. Now, the Germans had bombed the British at the beginning of the war, and that didn't really negatively affect British morale as far as the war effort went, right? The attitude was more, give it back to them, right? There was a lot of defiance we saw from the British. And even in Germany, it's arguable that this idea of morale bombing, trying to affect civilian morale, really is an effective way to get people to surrender or to bow to your will, right? So effectively, but there's still that perception that just through air power, just through damaging people's wills, you could win wars. When we first began to employ the B-29, it's not very effective. It does not do what it was supposed to do. Because the B-29 was supposed to fly so high that it could drop an accurate payload on its target, and by the time the Japanese fighters got up to engage it, it had already be on its way home. That's the theory here, okay? It doesn't work. When we first start bombing Japan, it's just not working. It's just not as effective as we thought it would be. And yet we keep doing it. I think the first big raid against Japan was, if I remember, was right around Thanksgiving in 1944. And we had a lot of high hopes for it, and it doesn't work. It's not nearly as effective, as I say, as we thought it would be. Well, this goes on for a while, and then in early 1945, they replaced the general who commanded the 20th Air Force with Curtis LeMay. Curtis LeMay. I think I mentioned him briefly when we talked about the B-29 before. Well, LeMay comes up with the idea that we're going to start using the B-29 in a different way. We're going to start having the B-29s fly fairly low to the ground. In fact, he was planning on having raids that would fly B-29s instead of 30,000 feet or whatever. I don't remember what the ceiling was. They would fly like 500 feet. Now, of course, this makes it much more vulnerable to anti-aircraft guns, and it's a big plane, right? Much more vulnerable to anti-aircraft guns and opposing fighters, and you really don't have fighter cover here. escorting fighters. So when they start, it was funny because Curtis LeMay had called his subordinate and said, I want you to start doing training runs at 500 feet. And of course there was a near mutiny. So he called him back and said, you're going to do it at 50 feet. And he said, you're crazy. We're not going to do it. And he says, you're going to fly these training missions at 50 feet, or I'm going to court-martial you. And the guy, then they start doing 50 feet. And then he said, now they're not going to complain when I tell them they have to fly the actual missions at 500 feet. Right? So they start flying these things in low, and they are far more effective at hitting their targets at this height. Far more effective. So this instantly starts to become the kind of weapon that they thought it would be. But of course, you are taking more losses than you thought you might. Now, what we have here then on the night of 9 to 10 March 1945, what we have here is the raids of, it was called Operation, do I have it up here? No. Operation Meeting House. Operation Meeting House. And this essentially was the firebombing of Tokyo. Now, to this day, this remains the single most destructive 24-hour period in military history. The single most destructive 24-hour period in military history. 334 B-29s dropped over 1,600 tons of napalm incendiary bombs on the city. Now, again, we'd seen this in Germany. In July of 43, we had Operation Gomorrah, which was the destruction of Hamburg, and then just in in February, just a few weeks earlier, we had the destruction of Dresden by incendiaries. And now we're doing it in Japan. But the destruction that is caused in Japan is far, far, far more effective than it is in Germany, because in Japan, most of your buildings are made of wood and paper. Right? Most of your buildings are made of wood and paper. Most of the buildings in Germany are made of brick and mortar and stone. So we create these massive firestorms in the city. Right? Massive firestorms are created in the city. And one of the first things people would do is, of course, if it's so hot, literally, you're standing out in the open, and it would be so hot your clothes would just catch on fire. There's no... like the fire wouldn't leap onto you, it would just get so hot your clothes would start to incinerate. And it was so, people were burning, it was so bad. The first thing you're going to do is, there are rivers there, you want to jump in the river. Because the napalm actually lands on the surface of the river. And so literally you would jump in there, you'd cool yourself down, but you couldn't come up for air or you'd burn. Okay? So, and you wouldn't get any oxygen anyway because the fire would be taking it all. This is the first American raid on the Japanese capital that causes significant military effects. It has a military effect here by this raid on the capital. James Bradley wrote a great book called Flyboys. It was about these pilots, and he talks about this raid, and he mentions how there was this woman, and she had like a backpack, a Japanese woman. She had like a backpack with her baby in it. And she was running as fast as she could from the flames. And even as she's running away from it, the backpack catches on fire because it's facing the flames and it burns the baby. And to this day, Curtis LeMay, many people consider him to be a war criminal for what happened. So anyway, they go ahead, they bomb this city. And Japan is the first. The United States now has a policy of systematically destroying by air every major Japanese city. Okay? So what's going to happen is, after World War II, the United States will create something called the United States Strategic Bombing Survey. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey. And this is a commission that is trying to determine exactly how effective was the bombing in both Germany and Japan. So you have this United States Strategic Bombing Survey right here at the end of, or after World War II. And it is created, as I say, to assess the effectiveness of American bombing. And you have teams in Europe and in Japan here that are assessing these. Paul Nitz, I know, who's going to be one of the big, Nitzy, he's going to be one of the big kind of Cold Warriors and work with George Kennan and stuff. And throughout the Cold War. But he was one of the guys that was on these things. But the report they write here on this in this raid, this report stated, quote, probably more persons lost their life by fire at Tokyo in a 6-hour period than at any time in the history of man. More people burned to death in 6 hours there than in any comparable 6-hour period in the history of man. Possibly 100,000 Japanese are killed in this raid. Possibly 100,000 Japanese are killed in this raid. That arguably is probably more than the total combined of those that died in Hamburg and Dresden. Like I said, it's much more effective here in Japan. You probably have another 100,000 who are wounded and missing as a result of this. 16 square miles of the city of Tokyo was reduced to ash. 16 square miles of Tokyo was reduced to ash. Victor Davis Hanson, of course, the historian Victor Davis Hanson, he actually mentioned his father flew on this mission. His father flew on this mission. And he said the crew, as they are flying through and delivering it, because they, of course, weren't the first, the city had already been burning. They said as the crew commenced on this mission, they could smell burning wood and burning human flesh in the plain. 50 miles away, 10,000 feet, they could see the fires. So, it's bad. And as I say, this is just the beginning. This is a process of destroying, as I say, every major Japanese city, just like this. So now we have, of course, Iwo Jima. Iwo Jima, you can see, is right here, so it's a lot closer here. Now, these B-29s that are taking off to bomb Japan, they're taking off here from Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, okay? They're taking off from these islands, going up there, bombing, coming back. Iwo Jima, as you can see, is almost kind of halfway. And the theory was, we had a lot of pilots that would have to ditch, either coming or going, they'd have to ditch. Or land, or there's some problem. Maybe some of their engines weren't working, something else is wrong. In fact, there were a lot of guys that would call mechanical errors and turn around, and it turned out these were just minor things that they shouldn't have turned around for. And Colonel LeMay actually says, okay, if you do that, if you come back and you just got some kind of minor issue with your plane, we'll court-martial you. So he told these captains, we'll court-martial you if you come back and your plane is still operational to fly. So that kind of cracked down on that. But still, they wanted a place to have where people could land somewhere between there. So they decided here Iwo Jima is a perfect place to do it. Iwo Jima is kind of a flat island. It's kind of roughly triangular. And at the end here is this giant mountain, Mount Suribachi. Mount Suribachi. And so on February 1945, the American 5th Amphibious Corps, it lands at Iwo Jima. It's part of the 5th Fleet. And you have 21,000 defenders on Iwo Jima. 21,000 defenders here on Iwo Jima. And it's commanded, the Japanese are commanded by Tadamichi Kuribashi. Tadamichi Kuribashi. And Nimitz is, of course, in overall command. Chester Nimitz here is in overall command. But the ground assault is led by Holland Smith. Now, we talked about Holland Smith last time. He's the guy that relieved Ralph Smith, the Army general. We hit the beaches. Ultimately, we'll have about 110,000 Marines and other personnel. 110,000 Marines and other personnel. So we've got about a 5-to-1 advantage here in numbers. But the Japanese had all taken an oath that before they died, before they were allowed to die, they had to take 10 American Marines with them. Before they died, they swore an oath to the Emperor they would kill 10 American Marines before they died. And this way, of course, they're hoping to neutralize the numbers here. I mentioned, when we were talking about France, I mentioned J. Lawton Collins, who commanded the 7th Corps in France. He is one of the few American generals that commanded units both in the Pacific against the Japanese and in Europe against the Germans. And he later said, after the war, I was reading a transcript of an interview with him, and he said, the Germans were much more technically proficient at war. They understood the science, the mechanics of war much better. He said, but the Japanese were much more ferocious and tenacious, and they just would not give up. So the invasion was preceded by 76 days of bombardment. 76 days of bombardment. 3 days before the landing, the Fifth Fleet begins this even more intense bombardment here. Along the island's only 7 miles long, so you do that, you're going to kill something. You do that enough, right? So they open up an even more intensive bombardment to prepare for the landing 3 days before the landing. Now the problem is, despite the bombardment, as powerful as bombardment is, and this is a lesson we learned in the First World War, most people, if you're not in a direct line of fire, you're going to be okay. If you're in a trench, unless something directly hits you, if you're dug in, if you're prepared, you're probably going to survive. In World War I, one of the things is they had barbed wire everywhere, and the theory was if you bombard enough, you can take down all the barbed wire. And I was watching one of those shows where they kind of debunk things, and they actually ran these tests, and they showed that barbed wire is virtually indestructible to the kind of artillery fire. And again, unless it's a direct hit, it's not going to do anything to it, So the Japanese are dug in here fairly well. And the Japanese artillery is dug in. There's caves in these mountains. They've got mortars. They've got guns. They've been fairly effective. At holding these things here. They had actually dug an intricate tunnel system inside Mount Suribachi. So you have all these little kind of entrances where they can position themselves with guns and mortars and artillery. And the United States 4th and 5th Marine Divisions are the first to hit the beach, followed by the 3rd Division. And, of course, the Japanese machine gun and artillery fire just rakes them as they come ashore. I was actually going to show a clip from Letters from Iwo Jima today, but I want to get through this, so I'm not showing clips today. But see that movie. If you've not seen Letters from Iwo Jima, see that movie. And then you got to watch Flags of Our Fathers, which is the American point of view, and then Letters from Iwo Jima is a Japanese point of view. But see it. It's an amazing film. Clint Eastwood directed both of them. Great films. Well, as they come on shore, this machine gun fire, these artillery is much more effective. The 5th Division goes left on the island to attack Mount Suribachi, and the 4th goes right to there's a fortified quarry there. That was their going. You bring on Sherman tanks here on. You don't see tanks used a lot in Europe or in the Pacific like you see in Europe, but you do see them employed here and there, and they're brought on here to back them up. But the United States Marines are sustaining really heavy casualties here on Iwo Jima. By the end of the day, to give you an idea, there was a battalion that went into the fight with 700 men. There's a battalion that went into the fight with 700 men. By the end of the day, at the end of the first day, they had 150 men. I saw a thing once. Neil Maxwell, who was a leader of the LDS Church, I saw a speech by him, and he was talking about this, and he was there. And he was talking about it's like 19 years old, just scared to death. Said, we were all just, and they did it. He says, what else was there to do? We did it. By nightfall of that first night, there's 30,000 Marines on the beach. They dig in. They expect a Japanese counterattack. But Kobayashi is different than a lot of Japanese commanders. He doesn't see the need to launch these just suicidal bonsai charges that so many Japanese soldiers did. He says, it's not going to work. We're going to get mowed down. Better to hold positions and let the Americans come to us. So they approach these mountain tunnel entrances at Suribachi rather carefully, and they drop satchel charges in them. That's the way they're trying to clear them, is by dropping satchel charges in there. And on the 3rd day, members of the 28th Marine Regiment made it to the top of the mountain, and they give us this photo here. Now, they had already actually planted a flag. I think it was that evening. And then the next day, they said, well, let's commemorate. So they take a picture. So this is not the first time they planted the flag. They'd already planted it a few hours earlier. But then we get this here. This, of course, now this is immortalized in this photograph and statues. The United States Marines planting the flag here on Iwo Jima. James Forrestal, who's the United States Secretary of the Navy, and again, remember, the Marines are part of the Navy. James Forrestal, he was actually on a ship watching this, and he saw this raising. He was watching with binoculars as the raising happened. While he's on this ship, he leans over to Holland Smith, And he says, quote, "The raising of that flag on Suribachi means a Marine Corps for the next 500 years." Right? He's saying this is one of those moments that just it makes this thing bulletproof practically, right? You know, it's funny too, just along those lines. When the British were in Crete and the Germans were coming, and the British fleet was going to evacuate the British soldiers from Crete, the Germans had some pretty heavy gun emplacements. They were going to lose a lot of ships, and so they said to one of the admirals, I can't remember who it is that's killing me. They said to one of the admirals there, "We can't risk it. We can't risk the Navy evacuating the army." And this admiral said, what did he say? He said, "It'll take us 3 or 4 years to build a new fleet. It'll take us 300 years to build a new tradition." You know, so great line. The next day, the Marines secured 2 air bases on the island. Now, the next few weeks here on Iwo Jima are a meat grinder. The Japanese are forced to pay for, or the Americans are rather forced to pay for every inch of ground they take from the Japanese. On 8 March, one Japanese commander, against orders, engages in a bonsai charge. And again, the Americans are able to fight it off, but they take some pretty high casualties. The battle ends on 25 March. 25 March. The Americans take about 6,800, roughly 6,800 killed or mortally wounded, and over 19,000 others wounded. Over 19,000 that will survive, right? 19,000 others. The Americans capture 54 Japanese soldiers. 54 out of 21,000 on the island, they capture 54 soldiers. 2 of them later commit suicide. The rest of the 21,000 defenders of the island were dead. 21,000 defenders dead. They were going to make the Americans pay for everything there. Any questions? Okay, so now we have the Battle of Okinawa. Okay? So Okinawa is actually over here. It's in this island chain. And Okinawa was considered to be a part of the island chain, part of the home islands. The Japanese considered it part of their home islands, right? And in fact, originally the plan was not to go for Okinawa at all. They had originally planned it in late 1944 to launch an operation against Taiwan, or as it is known, Formosa. That was the original plan. However, it was decided that Okinawa was a better target. It's considered Japanese home island, so there's a psychological element there. But it also would provide much closer airfields to Japan. And it could be used ultimately for when the United States decided to launch an actual invasion. They could use Okinawa as a staging ground. There. Now, the Battle of Okinawa was called Operation Iceberg. Operation Iceberg. And this is a joint Army-Navy venture. A joint Army-Navy venture. Now, again, this is taking place in the Pacific Ocean area. So this is Nimitz, right? Nimitz has the ultimate authority over this operation here. This is the first time in the war, and in fact the only time in the war, where you will see the Navy commanding Army units on land. Because prior to this, they'd used Marines, right? They may have had a few Army detachments here and there, but you actually see a field army, an American field army, commanded by the Navy here on Okinawa. Now, George Marshall, so Nimitz essentially gets to pick what Army officer he wants to run this operation. But of course, he's going to defer to George Marshall's judgment. And Marshall, and this is really what I wrote my whole dissertation about, Marshall, he picked some real winners, and Eisenhower and Patton and these guys, but he picked a lot of losers too, right? And for whatever reason, he really, really, really likes Simon Bolivar Buckner. Okay, he really likes Buckner. Now, Buckner, as I talked about last time, Buckner was in charge of Alaska for much of the war. He did a fine job, but, he's ordering guys to build defensive works, and he's doing a good job, but it's not really combat. In 1943, you have some Marine units take back Attu and Kiska, which the Japanese had conquered. These are islands on the Alaskan island chain, and he, I think, observed it, but he had no real command authority there. And then, of course, like I say, he chaired that bored about the Holland, the Ralph Holland, or Holland Smith, Ralph Smith debacle there on Saipan. And so he's kind of acceptable to the Navy because they saw he was kind of fair in that, which of course has nothing to do with fighting a war, right? But critically here too, here's the thing about Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr. A lot of good qualities, but the guy has never seen combat in his life. And he's going to lead an army, a field army, okay? He has no idea how really a division works, how a corps works, even a regiment. He doesn't know how these things work. And yet, for whatever reason, Marshall really likes the guy, and he wants to give him a command. And so Marshall kind of lets Nimitz know, this is a good guy. Nimitz likes him because he was fair in the board for the Smith versus Smith, so he goes ahead and he gives him his shot here. So he is going to command the United States 10th Army. The United States 10th Army. So again, this is a way to kind of heal the inter-service rivalry. He actually, when he was in Alaska toward the beginning of the war, he wrote this poem about an admiral, the admiral that was serving there, that was like, it pretty much all but called him a coward. And both he and the admiral nearly got relieved because of this incident. And ultimately, the papers it over. So that's why I think he was hypersensitive to that rivalry afterward, is because he nearly got in trouble for it before. Now, Okinawa itself, the island here, have I got it? Yeah, the island here on Okinawa is about 66 miles long, and at its widest, it's about 7 miles. At its widest, it's about 7 miles. Now, the Japanese are defending it here with the Imperial Japanese Army, the 32nd Army. And this is under the command of Mitsuru Yoshijima. Now, the 10th Army itself, the U.S. 10th Army, has two corps. It has the 3rd Amphibious Corps, which is Marines. Amphibious Corps usually means Marines, right? 3rd Amphibious Corps, which is Marines. And then it's got the 24th Corps, which is Army. And the 24th Corps, this Army Corps, has about 172,000 men. 32nd Army, as I say, has about 100,000 men. Japanese, about 100,000 men there. With this Army Corps, we've got about 172,000. This operation begins on April 1st, 1945. The 10th Army, when it lands, it actually lands kind of here. You see where the Army comes in, the Marine comes in. No opposition whatsoever. Surprisingly little resistance. I think Ernie Pyle was watching, and he said he couldn't believe it. What casualties they were getting coming back were accidents, and he's like, he couldn't believe. He was expecting to see just this chain of ships bringing casualties back, and very few, and they were accidents. So Yoshijima decided not to defend the beaches. He wasn't going to defend the beaches. Rather, there are strong points on Okinawa that he is going to defend. He knows he can't hold the beaches with American naval and air superiority. He just can't do it. Now, Ernie Pyle, here it is. I got the quote right here. Ernie Pyle said, quote, "I had dreaded the sight of the beach littered with mangled bodies. My first look up and down the beach was a reluctant one. I realized there were no bodies anywhere, no wounded. What a wonderful feeling." And Pyle himself, not long after this island here, Ishima, Pyle will accompany the 77th Division to clear Ishima. And while they're on Ishima, he'll stick his head up to get a look, and machine gun just gets him right in the head, and he'll die there on Okinawa. Now, the day after the landing, U.S. forces, you can see, bisect the island. So the United States controls the island, across. So the Marines start moving north, and the Army starts moving south. By mid-April, the Americans had secured most of northern Okinawa, including the Matobo Peninsula there. They pretty much have cleared, by the middle of the month, most of northern Okinawa. But the Army assaults to the south. This is where they're going to get their strongest resistance. Nara, I think, is the capital, and it's just kind of in the south there. Buckner wrote his wife on 14 April. He noted the success in the north and these dangers that are really becoming apparent in the south. He said, quote, "We are up against the most formidable defenses yet encountered in the Pacific, well backed up by artillery and Navy mortars." On 18th of April, Buckner orders a major attack south, comprising the 7th, 27th, and 96th divisions, infantry divisions. This is the largest attack that the United States had made in the Pacific War to date. Largest land attack the United States had made in the Pacific War to date. Joseph Whelan, a historian of the battle, he said, quote, "The attack would be devoid of flourishes, feints, or flanking movements," meaning he's literally just sending his guys straight at him, okay? Which is never a good thing. It doesn't work for these Japanese bonsai charges. It's not going to work for the Americans. So losses are heavy on both sides. And after 4 bloody days, finally, the Japanese begin to fall back. But they create a very tough line here called the Shuri line. So the Shuri line is this defensive. There's the Shuri Castle right here, and this is a line that they got to break through. And it's a series of lines. The problem is this kind of mountainous territory. Now you got to remember, these Marines, by and large, have been fighting in these kind of South Pacific jungle places. This is not that. It's a completely different temperature here. In Okinawa, unlike these other places they've been fighting, you can have freezing temperatures, right? It can get pretty dang cold. So they're attacking here along the Shuri line. And as I say, the problem is it's mountainous. And frequently what the Japanese will do is you'll get the Japanese out of their positions, and then they'll just fall back to the next position. And it's just this slog of going through here and trying to get the Japanese out of these positions. Now, Buckner's methods here he called corkscrew and blowtorch. Corkscrew and blowtorch. Essentially, he would use generous artillery fire on a given point, and then bring in tanks with flamethrowers, supporting infantry, and they would try to seek out cave openings where the Japanese would usually fortify themselves, and they would pour fire and explosives into these things. But again, the Japanese can easily defend these. They can see them coming. They can easily defend it because, again, it's just these straightforward attacks here. Because Buckner really doesn't know what he's doing. Buckner really doesn't know what he's doing here. And they just, I mean, really, his tactics are proving kind of futile here. Because we have these problems going forward here on Okinawa, we have a secondary problem, and that is the Navy. What are the Japanese doing to the Navy at this time? What are the Japanese doing to the United States Navy? Kamikaze. Kamikaze attacks are increasingly frequent against the Navy. In April alone, the Japanese sink 13 Allied warships just with kamikaze attacks. 13. They damage over 100 more. Over 100 ships are damaged, right? At sea, the enemy is killing about 1,000 men, wounds about 26,000 others, and several more had gone missing. On 11 May, the Japanese hit Admiral Mark Michener's flagship, the Bunker Hill, the USS Bunker Hill. So these attacks are kind of embittering Navy officers against Buckner, because they're like, come on, wrap this up, we're sitting ducks here, right? Admiral Raymond Spruance, he writes to a friend, he says, quote, "I doubt if the Army's slow, methodical method of fighting really saves any lives in the long run. It merely spreads the casualties over a longer period. The longer period greatly increases the casualties when Jap air attacks on ships, when ships is a continuing factor. However, I do not think the Army is at all allergic to the losses of naval ships and personnel." Buckner had said, we've got to do the slow, methodical attacks to save lives. We've got to be careful here. But the Navy's paying the price, right? The Navy is paying the price. And what he's doing is not working the way he thinks it's working anyway. So anyway, on April 22nd, so this is just, 3 weeks after the initial invasion, Nimitz and other admirals, they actually come ashore in Okinawa and they visit Buckner's HQ here. And Nimitz tells Buckner here, he says, you need to get your army moving and wrap up the battle. And Buckner would say, well, now hold on. I have authority over the ground war. That was agreed. I have authority over the ground war. Nimitz responded, quote, "I'm losing a ship and a half a day. If this line isn't moving within 5 days, we'll get someone here to move it so we can all get out from under these damn air attacks." Now, here's the thing. Again, you have the Navy threatening the Army. So you have this institutional rivalry comes into it once again. Now, given that rivalry and given how much crap happened when you had a Corps commander, Marine Corps commander relieve an Army division commander, how much more crap would you have with a theater commander, Navy theater commander, relieving a field army commander? So he was probably bluffing. Nimitz was probably not prepared to relieve him for these reasons. But he's clearly not happy with the general. He is clearly not happy. I mean, ultimately he doesn't relieve Buckner, so I guess the proof's in the pudding. However, Buckner has options. Buckner has options here. One of the options he has is this guy here, Andrew Bruce, General Andrew Bruce. He is the commander of the 77th Infantry Division. Andrew Bruce says this: why don't we just launch an amphibious invasion on the south of the island to get behind the Japanese? And then we put the Japanese into kind of a two-front battle. We can sustain that kind of a battle. The Japanese cannot. However, Buckner said, no, it'll be another Anzio. Remember, Anzio just happened the year before. He said they got stuck there. It was a fiasco. We don't want another Anzio. He was convinced it would be another Anzio. So he declined. He does not agree to this landing there. You have other officers. Now, Douglas MacArthur, of course, he's not playing any role in this battle, but he's reading the reports from the battle. And MacArthur said, why do you even need to take the Japanese south of the Shuri line? Just bottle them up. We'll blockade it. They'll run out of food and supplies, and that'll be that. We don't need to take them. Just contain them. And some people said, yeah, we should do that. But Buckner said, no, we got to take it. We got to clear it. Now, Bruce is a real military innovator here. Bruce is a really smart guy. And he starts innovating these tactics. Now, one of the things, the Japanese would frequently do night attacks. They would frequently do night attacks. The Americans rarely did, because the doctrine of night attacks was it's too easy to get turned around, to shoot your own people, to get into a firefight with your own guys, so we didn't do it. However, Bruce did this. He would have night attacks, and they were very effective, because the Japanese weren't expecting them. And he actually succeeds in taking a lot of objectives by launching night attacks. Then further, instead of just creating these big objectives, okay, we're heading here, he said, we need to kind of create smaller objectives that give us better positions to launch artillery fire against major objectives. And so that's what they do. Instead of just going full at something, they would try to find a flanking objective, like a mountain or a hill or something, that then they could use, as I say, to sight artillery against that. And these methods are very successful for the 77th Division. And he's trying to get Buckner to do them, and Buckner kind of dismisses him as kind of this young pup, whatever. He kind of talks down to him. But clearly they're working more than the blowtorch and corkscrew method. On 18 June, Buckner is at a forward observation post. Actually, I should point out, too, Joseph Stilwell. During the war, I haven't really talked about Stilwell, but during the war, Joseph Stilwell was America's military advisor to Chiang Kai-shek in China, okay? And he spoke Chinese, so that's one of the reasons why he got the job, but he's a really good officer. But he and Chiang Kai-shek just butt heads. They don't get along. Finally, he leaves. They take him, recall him from that job. Well, they're kind of looking for a new job, and he's looking for a new job, and he's seeing what's going on Okinawa, and he wants Buckner's job. You realize Buckner's making a hash of it. He wants his job. So he actually goes on an observation. They send him there to write a report. So he's going there. He meets with Bruce, and Bruce is telling him what's going on. And there's this conversation between, Bruce later wrote a letter to his wife talking about this, and there's this conversation between Stilwell and Bruce, and you can see, Stilwell's just like, I'm sorry you got to go through this. I'm sorry this guy's such an idiot, So on June 18th, so this battle's now been going on for over 2 months, about 2.5 months. On June 18th, Buckner goes to visit a forward observation post, and while he is there, this forward observation post, this is the last photograph of Buckner taken. While he is at this forward observation post looking at the Japanese, he's got his helmet on that's got his stars on it. He's dressed up like a peacock, and he goes to the front here, and the Japanese see him, and they start shelling the place. So he is killed by artillery fire. He's killed by artillery fire here. He is the highest-ranking American military officer to be killed in the war that is confirmed by enemy fire. During the war, we'll have 4 lieutenant generals that are killed. We talked about Leslie McNair, who was killed by friendly fire in France. There was a guy named Frank Andrews. A lot of people thought if you've heard of Andrews Air Force Base around Washington, his name is Frank Andrews. Frank Andrews, a lot of people thought he would probably go on to be the guy that would command a major invasion of Europe. He probably would have had Eisenhower's job, and he lived. Frank Andrews was killed in a plane crash, I think in Iceland, There's a guy named Millard Harmon, who was actually roommates for years with Buckner when they were young men. But Millard Harmon, his plane went down in South Pacific. Now, here's the thing. It's possible it was shot down, but we have no evidence because we never found the plane. So we can't confirm that he was killed by enemy fire. And then, of course, Buckner here is killed on Okinawa. Well, the Japanese, there's one of the Japanese officers will survive the war, and he writes a kind of a memoir about it. And he says, we heard Buckner was dead, and we were thrilled. We saw this as a major victory, right? They were very happy, but then it becomes very obvious. In fact, he says they were celebrating like Iwo Jima, like told them, don't celebrate. This is not something to be happy about, And part of that was the fact that it didn't really change things, right? In fact, Stilwell is called back. He's going to take over the 10th Army. Well, 4 days after the death of Buckner, Iwo Jima and members of his staff, they all commit ritual suicide. They'll drab the sword in, cut it across, and as their guts start to fall out, a member of their staff behind them chops off their head. Right. That same day, I think it's the 22nd, resistance ends. Resistance ends on the island. Roughly 13,000 American soldiers and Marines are killed on the island or in the ships around the island. Another 40,000 were wounded. Now, again, we had about 110,000 Japanese soldiers there to begin with. At least 77,000 of them were killed on the island. At least 77,000 of 110,000 were killed on the island. And we took about another 10 to 15,000 prisoners. Some of them, at some points, maybe had been evacuated. There are tons of, we have Germans and Japanese and Americans all through camps all throughout, and the Italians, and yeah. In fact, have you ever seen The Godfather? Do you remember at the beginning of The Godfather, the one guy comes and he says, he works at the bakery, and he says, my daughter fell in love with this Italian POW that got a work release, so he was working in our bakery, and they fell in love, but he's going to ship him back to Italy, and he wanted to stay, so The Godfather takes care of it. Yeah. So this was an Italian who'd been captured in war, brought back to America, was in a camp, and then they offer him a work release so he could actually work at a job. And yeah, there's a great story. One of my favorite stories is one of these. I can't remember one of these camps, but they're guarding these German prisoners. This is like in Alabama or something, I think. They're guarding these prisoners, and these guys know, for them the war's over, right? They know the war's over. So they're out working, doing agriculture for the day, and time to get back up on the truck. So there's one guard there with his gun. They all jump up, they get back on the truck, and it starts taking off before the guard gets on there. So the guard starts running after it. He hands his gun to the prisoners, who then help him up. They give him back his gun, So.
What are they going to do, swim back?
Right. Okay, and there's actually there was one just kind of a less humorous anecdote in, I think it's Santaquin, Utah, right at the end of the war. In fact, I think it was maybe just a few months before the end of the war. I think it was before the end of the war with Japan. I think the war with Germany had still technically had ended, but we still have German prisoners they're guarding. They had a prisoner camp in Santaquin, Utah. And one of the guards was just nuts. And he kept talking about how he was mad. He'd literally been sent home from England because he had mental issues. So they say, well, let's let him guard prisoners. Well, while he's there in this camp, he kept saying how he wanted to get over there to fight and to kill Germans. He wanted to kill Germans. So one day, he's up in the guard tower one night. All these German prisoners are sleeping. He just takes the machine gun and just starts hosing the tents. Killed a bunch of Germans while they were sleeping. Yeah. And then he went to an insane asylum. Right before Pearl Harbor, in fact, the Friday before Pearl Harbor, Franklin Roosevelt signed the creation of the Manhattan Project. This is the secret project to create an atomic bomb. So in early 1942, an army of scientists descend on Los Alamos, New Mexico, and they begin work on building a bomb. The total cost to develop the bomb was $1.8 billion. That was equivalent to less than 9 days of American wartime spending. Okay? $1.8 billion, less than 9 days of American wartime spending. And again, the B-29 project was a more expensive project than the atomic bomb. Now, Harry Truman, of course, we know he becomes president here in April of 1945. In July, he is attending the Potsdam Conference with Stalin and Churchill, and then Clement Attlee after Churchill loses the election. And word arrives while Truman is in Potsdam, Germany. Word arrives that the Americans had test detonated his people had test detonated an atomic bomb. This was called the Trinity Test, July 16th, 1945. This is the first controlled nuclear explosion in the history of the world. In fact, supposedly some of the guys here at Los Alamos were taking bets about whether or not the reaction would not be controlled and it would ignite the Earth's atmosphere. I don't know why you would vote that would happen, or why you would bet that would happen, but some people apparently did. And of course, I know these two jokers are looking forward to the Oppenheimer film that's coming out later this year, which actually looks quite good. Christopher Nolan's film about Robert Oppenheimer, who's the chief scientist here on the bomb project. Well, Truman actually takes Stalin aside, and he says to him at this conference, I just want to let you know that we have created a weapon of unbelievable destructive power. And Stalin says something like, well, good, I hope you use it quickly against the Japanese. And Truman kind of thinks, well, he doesn't understand what I'm talking about. He doesn't understand just how powerful this was. In fact, Stalin knew exactly what was going on because he actually has spies at Los Alamos. And the Soviets will actually be able to get their own atomic bomb by 1949, which is about 5 years sooner than we thought they would, because you have spies that were sharing with them details of the atomic bomb. Truman's top advisors are telling him that if you drop an atomic bomb on a population center, you will kill 29,000 people. He's told, we estimate 29,000 people will be killed in an atomic blast. Now, at this time, American forces are already preparing for an invasion of Japan. Projected casualties for an invasion of Japan. If the United States were to invade Japan, they believed the United States military would take 300,000 casualties. 300,000 casualties. We also project further the Japanese civilian population military would take over 1 million casualties. Over 1 million casualties. So Truman is also looking at Okinawa. I had 13,000 American dead at Okinawa. If I had had an atomic bomb for Okinawa and I could have used it, I could have saved 13,000 American lives. Now here, with Japan, he's doing this devil's arithmetic. And he's saying, we can lose 29,000 people, or we can lose 1 million Japanese people and 300,000 American. And this is kind of how he's arriving at this, right? And so using that calculus, he makes the decision here to drop the bomb. Operation Downfall. This is the proposed invasion of Japan. Exactly how that would go down. And this is kind of showing essentially how that would go out. And actually, too, after the war ends, their projected start date, I can't remember when the projected start date was. It was like in September or October. But after the war had ended, like a week before they would have launched Operation Downfall had they gone forward, there was a massive storm that destroyed a lot of military infrastructure, and it probably would have made it untenable. But we have here Paul Tibbets, and Paul Tibbets commanded the 509th Composite Group. And this is a bombardment group that's made up of special pilots and special planes here for this mission. They actually train, his plane here is the Enola Gay. It was named after his mother. They actually train here at Wendover Airfield on the border of Utah and Nevada, as Wendover Airfield. And they create this in the war to train bombardment groups, and then they actually decide, when he selects this base, he's supposed to look at 4 or 5. Wendover's the first one he looked at. He said it's perfect. So when they set up there, all the other activity shuts down. That is the only thing they're training there is the 509th one that's there, because it's a secret project, right? And they got some nuclear technicians there, and they were all super secret. And of course, they go over, and there's places you could gamble there in Wendover. and they go and they gamble, and there would be FBI guys there that would start talking to them to see if they were going to spill the beans about what they were doing. And so it was pretty interesting. I actually wrote an article about that, about Wendover Airfield. August 6th, 1945, they dropped the first bomb on Hiroshima. About 8:15 in the morning, local time. Some estimates say approximately about 100,000 people were killed instantly or within the next few hours. 100,000 people. And in the coming weeks and months, more and more people die of injuries and radiation poisoning that happened as a result of the stuff. So it's significantly more powerful than even the military advisors believed it was. Now, Americans immediately informed the Japanese. No, they didn't just do this out of the blue. They warned the Japanese. They actually said to the Japanese, we have a weapon of destructive power. We will use it against you unless you surrender. They don't surrender, so we use the bomb. Now, some people suggested there should have been a demonstration. We should have had it off-sea, blown it up just so people could see. They thought, what's really going to make these people see the light, so to speak, is actually having it used against Hiroshima here, which was a major port. So we say, if you don't surrender immediately, we will use more of these. Now, we only have 2 bombs in theater. Okay, we only have 2 bombs on Tinian, and that's the first one. There's a uranium bomb and a plutonium bomb. What were their names? What were the names of the bombs? Fat Man and Little Boy. Right. So now something very important happens here. The Japanese do not immediately surrender, and there was hope amongst the Japanese that they could induce the Russians, the Soviets, into arbitration and leading arbitration between the United States and the Allies against the Japanese, because the Soviet Union has still not declared war on the Japanese. It's still technically neutral. Well, in the morning of August 9th, we dropped the second bomb. This was dropped from a plane called Boxcar, and it is on Nagasaki, which also had a port. Perhaps 60 to 80,000 Japanese are killed immediately with that attack. Now, here's the thing. That same day, in fact, within hours of the dropping of the atomic bomb, the Soviet Union declares war on Japan and begins to invade Japan. So the Japanese cabinet meets several times that day to try to decide what to do. Okay, the Japanese meet several times to decide what to do. But they can't really reach a consensus. Some people say, well, I'll get to that. The emperor finally, when they were at Potsdam, they actually produced something called the Potsdam Declaration. And the Potsdam Declaration was kind of provided a blueprint for the way Japan could surrender. Right? Now remember, there's this idea of unconditional surrender. And yet, with Potsdam, we actually, controversially, allow a little loophole there. And the loophole is, if Japan surrenders, we will allow them to maintain the monarchy. We will allow them to retain the monarchy. Okay? So, after Nagasaki, the emperor actually came out and he said that he favored peace on the basis of the Potsdam Declaration. For a few days within Japan, they're discussing this, and there was briefly an unsuccessful coup against the emperor. When it became obvious the emperor was going to look for peace, you have this younger generation of officers that actually attempt to put the emperor under house arrest, and he had made a recording on a phonograph essentially saying that he was prepared to surrender. And he made this recording, and before they could air it, because they know if this goes out over the airwaves, and the emperor had never done anything like this before. The emperor had never addressed the people before. If this goes out, we're done. The people won't keep fighting. So these army officers actually try to arrest the emperor and take down this, but they're able to get the phonograph record broadcast, and that was it. That's all that happened. So the Japanese announced their intention to surrender on 14 August. And this comes to be known as VJ Day, Victory over Japan Day. And, of course, famous photograph. And this, of course, would be a Me Too movement today. I actually saw they had an interview, 10, 15 years ago. They were still alive. And they found each of them, and they talked about that day. They didn't know each other. They didn't have any contact since then, but they're immortalized in this photograph. The Japanese then will formally surrender on September 2nd, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Harbor. General MacArthur will oversee the ceremony, and among the attendees were General Percival, the British General Percival, who conducted the British surrender at Singapore, the British at Singapore, and General Jonathan Wainwright, who was the American general who surrendered to the Japanese at the Philippines in early 1942. They'd been released, and so they were present here. So World War II, which lasted approximately 6 years and 1 day, is finally over. Approximately 70 to 85 million men, women, and children had died in the war, which represented approximately 3 to 4% of the world's population. The single greatest event in human history. Now, just getting back here to the Japanese decision to surrender. I've heard it argued. There's a great book, and it's a Japanese author, and I can't remember his name. But the book's called Racing the Enemy. And he actually suggests that more than the atomic bombs, it was the Soviet attack that led them, because after that they realized there was no lifelines to get out of the war. So, you'll never fully know there.